welcome everybody. Welcome Fritjof and Anil. Welcome for joining the Bridging Foundations for a Liveable Future. This is a project that gave birth during lockdown. Because I was speaking with Sebastian Gadgedo, who co-founded this project with me, because we were seeing, the unfolding of this health crisis globally. And we were also seeing the relation to other crises, an economic crisis, financial crisis following, the ecological crisis, and we see that they are interconnected. So that was really very, very much touching us. We were also seeing how globally people are responding. In the most difficult of lockdown moments, people were mobilizing, offering each other help all around the world. And that was really touching. So these are very important moments. Welcome. Welcome, thank you very much. Thank you, Fritjof Capra.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Yes. Your work is connecting conceptual changes in science, connecting this with the broader changes in worldview and values that are, happening here in society. You are a Vienna-born physicist and a systems theorist, and you became very famous through the book, The Tao of Physics, initially.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And we're also being joined by Professor Anil Gupta. Anil, you are a recognized pioneer in the field of grassroots innovations. You're the author of the book Grassroots Innovations, Mind on the Margin and Not Marginal Minds. You founded different organizations, including the Honey Bee Network and GIAN, if I pronounce it correctly, Grassroots Innovation Augmentation Network. So now that we're all together and have welcomed you, let me kick off with the first question. And please feel free to address, the work that you have done through these questions. What is it that the world can learn from grassroots innovation, and why is that so important now?
Well, as you know, Camila, that the material resources are becoming scarce. The world is becoming more fragile. The climate is becoming more volatile. And the gap between rich and the poor is also expanding. Now, what is the resource in which poor people are rich? They could be rich in ethical values. They could be rich in creativity. They could be rich in their culture. They could be rich in their hospitality for any stranger. So the resources in which poor people are rich, if we build upon them, we find a new paradigm of development. Remember, development is opposite of envelope. Envelope is to cover, develop is to uncover. And therefore, when we uncover the grassroots creativity of common people, people who live by their hands, farmers, artisans, mechanics, roadside vendors. What do they have with them? They have to survive in a world which is very difficult and very challenging and often demanding in terms of institutions and resources. So they do what they can do best, which is leverage their knowledge, leverage their creativity. And another reason why the world should listen to the voices from grassroots is that these people have managed to leverage what they are rich in, which is their knowledge. Therefore, they do not get constrained by the material resources. They take it as a given. It is a fact that they don't have material resources. Now, in a world which is losing out on material resources, what does it need? It needs solutions that are low on material, high on knowledge. In any case, we all know that entropy increases with more and more material. So dematerialization is what we should be moving towards. And who will be the best guide for dematerialized economy? The common people, the creative people, who anyway don't have access to the material resources. So therefore, that's the reason why grassroots innovations can provide us both conceptual and operational pivot on which we can build the future vision of our inclusive society.
Thank you. Yes. Fritjof, is there anything that emerges in you?
Yes, there's lots. I could talk for a whole hour now commenting on what Anil just said, because he touched on so many important things. To me, you know, all the things you said, Anil, are really qualities of community. What I hear really is the importance of community. For instance, ethics. Ethics is usually thought of in terms of religion or in terms of philosophy, but you can also think about it in a much general way as behavior for the common good. Ethics is always related to community. When you belong to a community, you behave accordingly. And then development is a very interesting topic also, because there are two senses in which we use development today. We in the scientific community use development as an essential property of all life. All living organisms develop, all living organisms change, and then, you know, species develop, and that this is what we call evolution. So development is part of the self-organization of living systems. And then economists use development in a very different way. They use it in a narrow sense of economic development measured by GDP, which is a very rough, non-specific indicator, and modeled after northern development, after a certain model, which, as we have learned in the last decade or so, consists mainly in the systematic transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. So this is what they are telling the South what they should do, develop according to this model. So what we need is to sort of liberate the concept of development and really associate it with life. And I think this is, I see that this is what you're doing, and I'm very curious to hear more.
Can I jump in, because the word self-organization has been mentioned in relation to development and this new definition of development. Fritjof, you have written a lot about science and nature and about what self-organization really implies. I think this is a very, very rich and very
I have spent the last 30 years of my life synthesizing a new conception of life that has emerged in science. I was trained as a physicist originally, and the book, my first book, which you mentioned, The Tao of Physics, in that book I compared the concepts of modern physics to the concepts of Eastern spiritual traditions. And then I moved away from physics to the life sciences, to ecology, you know, systems theory, complexity theory, where this new concept of life has emerged, which I call the systems view of life. And what it is essentially is a very profound change of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine to seeing the world as a network. And these living networks have been studied very extensively at the forefront of science in the last few decades. One of the, in my view, one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century, of the second part of the 20th century, has been that the network is the basic pattern of organization of life. Wherever we see life, we see networks. So we have food webs in ecology, networks of organisms. We have social networks, which we all know very well now. We have biological networks. Every cell is a network of molecules. Every tissue is a network of cells, and so on. And these living networks have the key characteristic that they are self-generating. they continuously generate and regenerate themselves. And that is also known as self-organization. That's why it is so important.
Yes. So when grassroots initiatives and grassroots innovation is seen as a self-organizing phenomena.
Well, I also use a term called as autopoiesis.
Right.
Autopoiesis implies self-designed, self-correction, self-governed.
Yes.
So, for example, when I'm talking to you, I have cells in my body which are mutating. Thankfully, these mutations are not cancerous, so I can continue to talk. What is my body doing? It is either repairing those cells, replacing those cells, bypassing those cells, or substituting them. Now, this process of self-healing, self-correction is also witnessed in many grassroots innovations because people have very limited resources and they incrementally keep on evolving them, modifying them, adapting them, evolving them into different needs. So many of the grassroots innovations are multifunctional and they try to adapt in different ways and therefore they diversify into different directions. So when they evolve in different hands, the condition, the socio-ecological condition of that person who is using this technology or using this innovation tries to then blend it with their condition, and so it diversifies into different directions. There are many examples that I could give you later, but it is enough to say that what you have said just now is a very important part of the knowledge itself which emerges from the grassroots. I'm not saying that all knowledge from the grassroots will have this characteristic because innovations can both be sustainable and non-sustainable. There are innovations that people produce which we don't want. For example, people use dynamite to catch fish. Even the small fish gets caught and becomes dead, and also the large fish. This is a non-sustainable technology, but it is grassroots. And it is creative, but it is not sustainable. So I don't want to imply that grassroots innovations are always sustainable. I don't want to imply that grassroots innovations are always in favor of the environment and ecology, but often they are.
Yeah, but we can turn this around now and say, what are sustainable solutions? And in fact, we can just ask what is sustainability? Because the concept of sustainability has been used in erroneous ways, has been co-opted by corporations and often has been trivialized. So it's good to remind ourselves that a sustainable society or a sustainable community is one that lives in such a way that its ways of life do not interfere with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. And if we want to do this, obviously, we have to understand how nature sustains life. And we have to understand the basic principles that ecosystems have evolved to sustain the web of life. And without going into details, just in a nutshell, we can say that nature sustains life by creating and nurturing communities. From the very first evolution of bacteria over 3 billion years ago, these bacteria have formed what is called bacterial colonies, communities of bacteria. And over billions of years at every level of life, nature has formed communities of living organisms. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms. And so this is another reason why community is so important. A sustainable solution is a solution within community because the unit of sustainability, if you wish, is the community. This is how I see it.
It is true and not so true both ways because communities are also fragmented. Communities can also get fractured. Communities can also get divided.
Yes.
Communities can also curb the individual initiative, particularly of the people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. We have seen this all our history, full of that. So how do we create communities of practice of those who are solving problems? So in a village, let us say there are 2 or 3 people who are, we often call them oddballs, who have solved a problem ingeniously. So community need not be proximal community. It can also be distant community. Community need not be a spatial community. It can also be a sectoral community. That means weavers may form a community, but in a one village, there may be only 2 or 3 weavers or 5 weavers. So like that, we'll have to think of different conceptions of community, but certainly there is a need for peer group. And this peer group, which is of people who appreciate, tolerate, and sometimes encourage the innovators who are defying the convention, who are trying to use materials, method, and applications in a new way, is certainly very welcome and an integral part of sustainability. I agree with that.
Yeah, of course, there can be all kinds of communities, in the United States, for instance, that there are communities that promote white supremacy. That is very much discussed here with the Black Lives Matters movement and the fight against social injustice. So what I want to say is that community is a necessary framework for sustainability, but of course not all communities will be sustainable. But the other reason why community is so important is that today, around the world, especially in the North, one of the main obstacles against the attempt to create a sustainable future is the constant onslaught by corporations who tell us through advertising that we can only be happy if we consume material goods. You have to buy my product for you to be truly happy. If you watch commercials on American television, you will always see that they start with a beautiful environment, happy people, happy families, and you don't even know what they're going to advertise. It may be blue jeans, or maybe health insurance, it may be cars, whatever. It's material consumption. Now, if we can demonstrate that true happiness lies in enjoying human relationships rather than material consumptions, in other words, in community, that is a very powerful antidote. And it can also be seen in the way you mentioned in the beginning, Anil, as solutions that are low on materials and high on knowledge, or you could say high on human relationships, high on values, high on human affection, and so on. That's another reason why community is so important.
When we started 30 years ago, I want to show you the logo of Honeybee Network so that the point becomes a little more clear. And you will see the point. If you see the logo of Honeybee Network, a nameless, faceless person comes in contact with the network, which is what you're referring to as community. Comes in contact with the network, gets an identity.
Yeah.
So we give voice, we give visibility, and we give velocity to the ideas of creative people. Creative people who have solved a problem in their own ingenious way, in an affordable way, in an extremely frugal way. And this community, which is what we have talked about as Honeybee, essentially does 4 things. It cross-pollinates. So ideas of innovators from one place are available to the ideas in another place through open innovation, open databases. And that is what Honeybee does when it cross-pollinates flowers. That's very fundamental for life, for reproduction of life, for sustainability of nature. You need honeybees cross-pollination. But when it takes pollen away, the flowers don't complain. They, in fact, invite the bees, which means that when we take the knowledge of the people, they should not feel impoverished. They should not become anonymous. They should not feel shortchanged. So there has to be a responsibility and reciprocity toward the people who provide knowledge. And third, whatever we learn from them must go back to them in local language. And finally, if we add value and generate any economic return, a reasonable share of that return must go back to people. These were the 4 principles with which we started 30 years ago, before the Earth Summit took place, before anybody was talking about how the benefits of the value addition in biodiversity, other resources should take place. And you're absolutely right that this creation of the community, creation of the Honeybee Network brought so many volunteers together to us. So for example, when scientists try to validate the knowledge of the people, they don't charge us for their time. When intellectual property lawyers try to help us with patents, they didn't charge us for their time. So a lot of social and ethical capital of Honeybee Network converted into a financial capital in the sense of cost, which we did not have to incur to bring the benefits to the people.
Yeah. I want you, please, if you leave this logo on for a minute, because I can relate this very well to the systems view of life. You see, as Camila mentioned in her introduction, I created a synthesis that integrates 4 dimensions of life: the biological, the cognitive, the social, and the ecological. And at the basis of the new conception of life is the pattern of the network. So social networks are networks of communication, as we all know, and like biological networks, they are self-generating, continuously self-creating, self-generating, or as you mentioned, Anil, autopoietic, that's the technical term. And as a social network communicates over time, there are feedback loops that come into play, and eventually the network creates a set of beliefs, a set of values, and a set of behaviors which are characteristic of the community. This, in my view, is when a network turns into a community, and this is what commonly is known as culture. The network creates its own culture. And I have been very interested in, I find it fascinating to study the dynamics of culture, because when you belong to a community, you behave in a certain way, and you show through your behavior that you belong. So on the one hand, the community creates a boundary, like biological networks, like cell membranes, for instance, but it's a cultural boundary. And on the other hand, by behaving in a certain way in a community, I acquire an identity. And this is what you pictured in your logo. That's why I find this so nice. And there is a very solid scientific foundation now in the systems view of life to understand this process of creating culture and creating identity. I would like to also ask you something, Anil, about the grassroots innovations, the solutions. To me, one of the key consequences or implications of the systemic understanding of life is the recognition that the major problems of our time, energy, environment, climate change, inequality, violence and war, now the COVID pandemic, you name it, none of these problems can be solved in isolation. They're all, I think you also mentioned that at the beginning, they're all interconnected and interdependent. They are systemic problems and they require systemic solutions. So a systemic solution is a solution that does not address any problem in isolation, but always in relationship to other problems. And as a consequence, systemic solutions often solve several problems at the same time. Do you observe this in your Honeybee network?
Yes, because as I said, multifunctionality is an inalienable feature of most solutions, if not all. Whether it's mechanical solutions, it is herbal solutions, these are agronomic solutions. So to give an example, a farmer found that when you give a lot of water to the crop, say cotton crop, then the stem becomes succulent and pests find it very easy to bite into. So he said, let us irrigate in the alternate row, 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 6, every 15 days or whenever the irrigation was required. Water requirement became half, succulence of the stem became less, pest attack became less, and the yield went up. And after some time, what he did, he gave irrigation between the two rows, which means the roots have to travel in the upper layer of the soil towards the water. Normally, people apply water towards the root of the plant. So that means the plant has no incentive to mobilize nutrients from the upper layer of the soil. So there are many practices where Harbhajan Singh was the name of this farmer. Many practices where they very carefully understand the way soil has been formed, the way nutrients are distributed, the way root structure is, the way root need to be led into the direction of the moisture by keeping it away from the root zone, and thus harness the nutrient from much larger area than otherwise would be possible. Yeah. There are many such examples I could give you.
Yeah, and this is also connected with science. You know, in my book, and I want to show a copy here. This is what I'm talking about: systems view of life. I have a very large section on agriculture and specifically on agroecology. And agroecology is the science of an ecologically oriented, regenerative, sustainable agriculture. And characteristically, agroecology is not only based on the science developed at our universities, but also on peasant knowledge, on indigenous knowledge, on grassroots knowledge. So agriculture and farming is a very rich field where community knowledge can be applied and has to be applied. And I see the shift from industrial agriculture to sustainable regenerative agriculture as the prototype of a systemic solution, because it would, if we had this shift on a large scale, it would significantly contribute to solving at least 3 major problems that we have in the world. One, it would reduce our energy dependence, because agroecology doesn't have these big energy inputs. Now in the United States, we use about 20% of our fossil fuel energy to grow food, to process it and transport it. Secondly, the organically grown food would have a tremendous impact, positive impact on public health, because as we know, many of our major diseases are a direct consequence of our diet. And thirdly, it would significantly contribute to deal with the climate emergency, because an organic soil is a living soil, which means that it draws down CO2 from the atmosphere and locks it up in organic matter. So this shift is, I always present this as a systemic solution par excellence.
Maybe I should go back to another illustration to just wrap up, or at least synthesize, crystallize for myself all the 3 points that you mentioned. You mentioned 3 issues, and I think they're very integral to the Honeybee Network. One was about the self-design, which is autopoiesis. Second is about systems view, and third is about how the energy is conceptualized by people in a very systematic way. So let me show you one example which you might find interesting from the point of view of its ability to convey what you are trying to say, and maybe you will see this point much better. Let me show you this screen. Now, this is a bridge made of tree roots. It takes about 30 to 40 years to build this bridge. We found it in Nogriat village during our learning walks. I have been walking in summer and winter and autumn every year for last more than 22 decades. And I've walked in every state of the country. So during one of our Shodhyatra learning walk, we came across this. So we asked people, why did you make bridge of tree roots? You could have made it of iron, you could have made of wood, you could have made of wire, you could have made of concrete. They said, no. The first question that we asked ourselves was that we need to do something which is different, which is sustainable, which will last for a long time, which will not cause any harm to the environment. Then we saw the roots of this tree, rubber tree on both sides of the river. We thought, oh, they look like rope. We could drag them, tie them. But then it could not be done by individual. It required group action. So we thought, all right, that's interesting. So culture is the first culprit which generates a quest for creative solution. Why did they have to do it? First was because they wanted to be different, they wanted to be sustainable. Second is institutions, collective action, and of course, rope for the technology. So technology is like word, institutions are like grammar, and culture is like thesaurus. We need all the three, and I just wanted to demonstrate this, that this is so integral to what you have said, is so fundamental in that sense to the grassroots innovation movement.
Before you go on, may I just ask you, I assume this bridge is continually growing and self-renewing.
Yes, it lasts for 200 to 300 years.
Yeah.
It takes about 30 to 40 years, 50 years to make, and lasts for 200 to 300 years, and it continues to grow.
Yeah.
Continues to grow around the stones, the root grow around the stone, and they keep on repairing it as and when it something has to fall down, stone falls into the river, and the leaves degrade. That's it. There's no entropy practically. Nothing is being damaged. Nothing is
beautiful.
Lost to the environment. So what I'm trying to say, therefore, is that it is possible. It is possible to illustrate many of the ideas that you're talking about through a very different lens, a lens of creativity, collaboration, and compassion. Compassion towards oneself, compassion towards colleagues, compassion towards nature, compassion even toward the perfect stranger.
And I was just going to ask you why you think these sustainable solutions are easily created in these communities. And I think I found the answer. So I don't even have to ask you. But it seems that these communities live close to nature. And when you look at nature, then all of nature's solutions are sustainable for the simple reason that those that were developed that were not sustainable were eliminated by evolution, by natural selection. They're not around anymore. So what we see in nature now has been honed over billions of years. And to give you just a very simple example, if you look at a tree has many, many functions. It gives shelter to many animals and insects. It protects people from the sun. It gives shade. It produces fruits. In photosynthesis, it draws down CO2 from the atmosphere. It has many, many functions, and as you showed, it can even build bridges. It can even contribute to bridges. So a solution in nature is always multifunctional, is always systemic. And somehow these communities just living in nature and observing nature have a great talent, a great creativity to create these systemic solutions.
Yes, however, I must also mention that people are not always as conscious of the need for nature to renew itself as they should be. So as I said, sometimes their time frame becomes short. They have to survive in the short term.
Yes.
And in that short time frame, for example, they may extract far too much of groundwater. So many times people don't realize that crops need moisture and not water. Whereas when you do flood irrigation, you're giving too much of water, leading to nutrient being leached down, leading to less aeration, leading to less microbial diversity and so on. So we should probably accept the paradoxical nature of this knowledge system, which produces contradictions. And some contradictions are contributing to the nature's renewal, but some contradictions are getting resolved in not being conducive to the nature's own process of renewal. And I think it is this paradoxical nature of the resolving conflicts and contradictions that we need to really focus on as to how do we take the future options, how do we expand opportunities for people without necessarily making their time frame short. See, today the problem is that our time frame is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter, whereas the nature requires longer and longer and longer.
Yes,
and that requires trust, that requires assurance, that requires great degree of social capital and ethical capital, which is getting eroded today. And I think we need to restore that as a central element of future design of institutions and design of our world as we would like it to be.
Yeah. Let me ask you something else, Anil. You have collected these grassroots innovations from these various communities, and how do you communicate that knowledge? You have written books. Do you have other means of communication to disseminate that knowledge? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So first of all, this is the newsletter that we have, Honeybee newsletter, which comes in different languages. It comes in Telugu, Tamil, Hindi, Gujarati, Odia, Telugu, and a few other languages. So first tenet that I mentioned was that people's knowledge must go back in local language, because they would not be able to understand Hindi or English or French or whatever to communicate. Second, as I told you that I have walked more than 6,000 kilometers in the last few decades. Every part of the country, every single state I have walked, from Andaman Island in the Bay of Bengal to from Indian Ocean to the Kashmir, Gurej Valley and Anantnag. Every single state. And as I told that in summer we go to the places which are hot, and winter we go to the places which are cold. So voluntary suffering is the essence of our approach to reach people. We don't have to convince them why they should listen to us. The very process of reaching there makes it apparent that we are there for conveying what we already know. So spreading is the first, sharing the first tenet of Honeybee Network, then searching new solutions, then celebrating the innovation. We honor people at their doorstep. We go to the villages, we find someone who has done a creative solution. Sometimes the people are not even aware of that the solution was so creative, because we come from outside, stay in the village overnight, discuss it and celebrate. And fourth is sensing the unmet need, sharing, searching, celebrating innovations, and sensing the unmet needs. When we sense the unmet need, we come across some very painful situations. For example, Mahua is a tree very much celebrated in the forest by the tribal communities. And the seed has a hard coat. So you have to break that nut for taking the kernel out to extract oil, which you use for your food and light. For 10,000 years, women have been using a stone to break this nut. We could not design a proper nut cracker afforded by a tribal community for that. So there are many stages, many facets of life where I must be very honest and admit, particularly the problem that women use, the processes that women are involved in, the rate of technological change has been very slow, if at all. And the ability of people to community to adjust and adapt rather than transcend the problem, in some cases has been constrained. Now, one can give various justification. They don't want material richness, they don't want income, but the fact is that their children don't go to school sometimes because they can't afford. So therefore, there are situations of this kind which we come across. Not every time the knowledge system is able to come to rescue from the problem that they're facing. Many times there's an inertia. And in every society there is inertia. In our society also there's inertia. And this inertia is much more evident in the cases of technologies that women use. So take the case of transplanting of rice. You know, transplanting is done by women in a back bending posture, as you might have seen sometime.
Yes, of course.
And for millions of women for thousands of years have been transplanting paddy in the same way in Asia, Southeast Asia, India, China. And we couldn't design a proper manual paddy transplanter. So there are areas where modern science and technology has refused to acknowledge certain problems, and grassroots innovators, for some reason of the technological understanding and their ability, they would also not solve the problem. So I'm not suggesting that grassroots innovators can solve all problems. I'm not suggesting that they're always very fair to the problem of men and women. I'm also not suggesting that they're equal opportunity for all kinds of problems to be solved. No, problems of women tend to get much slowly solved. So there are certain limitations, I must say, of this movement. But the fact remains that given all other constraints, it is still able to provide most affordable solutions to people which otherwise would not have been accessible.
Well, I was thinking maybe I could contribute something to your movement, because I have not only written this book about the systems view of life, by the way, co-authored with a colleague of mine, Pierluigi Luisi, who is a biochemist in Rome. I'm also teaching it as an online course. And this is a course of 12 pre-recorded lectures, and it includes a discussion forum with the participants. I have taught this now for over 4 years, and we have over 1,500 alumni in countries all over the world, including many in India. And this may not be appropriate for most of your honeybee communities, but for some of the community leaders, it may be appropriate. So if you're interested in that, and we give a lot of scholarships also, we could collaborate in that. The course is called Capra Course, and it's on the internet, easy to find. And it's a 12-week course of 12 lessons and discussions. So I'd be very happy to collaborate with you in the future in some way, within the context of this course on the systems view of life. If you
Certainly, it will be very interesting. I would like to take us back to the nature itself, because you must be familiar with the work on biological basis of knowledge, where Konrad Lorenz, the German ethologist, who was a great integrator of knowledge, and I was very inspired by the work that he did. So he at one place mentions very interestingly, he says, look at branches of all the trees. Look at branches of all the trees, look at fins of all the fishes, look at feathers of all the birds. And then he asks a simple question. What is the range of angle at which the fin, the feather, and the branch are set? And it is very interesting that range is hardly 15 to 90 degrees. Now, then he says something very interesting. The nature is very parsimonious. It has few designs and it plays with them all the time. And I find this very interesting because nature has enormous, it's very economical in using designs. I mean, every snowflake is a different crystal. No two trees are alike, no two birds are alike. And yet, the basic patterns which is organizing are few. Many times, grassroots innovators also show that richness of diversity. They take few functions. For example, bevel gear, when you have something moving like this, and there's a gear which moves it like this, horizontally. So a vertical gear and horizontal. This gear, among all the gear design, bevel gear occurs more frequently in grassroots innovations because they have to change the plane of movement from one direction to the another. So like that, there are certain phenomena, certain kinds of scientific and technological features. All grassroots innovations often involve movement from large gear to small gear. The spinning wheel of Gandhi had movement from large gear to small gear, whereas the modern technologies are from small gear to large gear, watch and motor and all of that. So there are some very interesting patterns.
Yeah, that's interesting. And now, what about the field of biomimicry, which I'm sure you have heard of? Does that play a role, mimicking nature, designing structures and processes that are, observed in nature and adapting them to some kind of technology? Do you do that in your communities?
Yes. So once I was talking to farmers in Kutch, a desert area, as to why we should not use chemical pesticide and why we should use the herbal pesticide and so on. After half an hour of my speech, one farmer got up and said, Professor, we understood what you're saying. I said, what am I saying? He said, you are saying that all the plants which cattle do not eat, animals don't eat, are the source of herbal pesticide. I had the knowledge, he had the wisdom. It took me half an hour to make a statement which he understood in one sentence. Now, it's a very interesting pedagogical tool all over the world, in Austria, in Germany, in US, in France, in India, in Southeast Asia. Everywhere this principle will hold. Which are the plants which animals don't eat? Some toxic plants. What do I need for pest control? Toxicity. Why do I need to buy pesticide then? Why can't I make my own pesticide? Now, this decentralized, distributed management of knowledge and adapting it to local conditions is what Gandhi talked about, is what essentially is the way forward in future, where we will have to have some organizing principles And these organizing principles of nature, or for that matter, life, will get adapted to different conditions in different ways. But basic principles will not be too many. And I think there is a merit in what this proposition holds for us.
You know, this reminds me of a story I heard in Bali many years ago. I met a lady in Bali who designs bamboo furniture. And so she told me the story that a problem with bamboo furniture are the termites.
Yes.
Because, you know, when you have a furniture and it's okay, you have a beautiful bamboo couch and for many months it's okay, but then the termites that are in the bamboo start acting up and the whole thing falls to pieces. So they, in Germany, a company did a lot of research how they can clean the bamboo of the termites before it is used in the furniture. And they developed a very expensive technological process. And then she went around in Bali and realized that the indigenous furniture doesn't have that problem. And so she asked them, you know, what did you do? How did you clean your termites? And they said, well, there weren't any termites because we harvest the bamboo at the full moon. So,
exactly.
You know, they observed the cycles of nature, and at a certain time, the bamboo was termite free, and you know, as simple as that.
No, that's a beautiful story because it's very evident in our country also this point as to how people maintain their bamboo furnitures, bamboo walls. All these huts are using bamboo structure for you know, as a wall and windows and whatever. So you are absolutely right. This shows that, you know, I'll give you one small example of how modern science in some cases is beginning to recognize and respect the traditional knowledge and knowledge of the communities. So in Manitoba, I had gone for the Hahn Memorial Lecture in University of British Columbia and another Carleton University in Canada in February. And I gave them an example that the advisory in the in the Department of Agriculture, Ontario, has an advisory that if you have a viral disease in roses and some other crops, wash your tools with milk. Now, use of milk as an antiviral agent has been published. We had published a review of that in Honeybee Newsletter many years ago. 1935 was the first study done. And in our country, we have many examples where people use milk for inactivating tobacco mosaic virus and foot and mouth virus, both the type 2 RNA viruses. Now, at least in this case, they say that this is as good as anything else could be. We don't have a better technology than that. But these are rare examples, very rare. And now you imagine a word which can benefit so much from the knowledge of the people, which is sustainable, which is scientific in nature, which is compatible with the scientific rest of the science, even that we are hesitating to use. So Professor, I think one of the missions that we would like your help in is to also make scientists more sensitive to drawing upon the wisdom where it's compatible with science. And when it is compatible with science, why not go ahead and accept that, yes, people could have found a solution with whatever method, but which works and works well.
And then it also becomes important not only to acknowledge the authorships of the solution, but also to acknowledge them financially, not extract the solution and then turn it into a product and sell it with a lot of profit and not give anything back to the rural community. So there has to be a fair exchange.
Professor, 99% of the publications of ethnobotany have never gone back to the communities from where knowledge was taken.
Yes, I know.
They have never acknowledged the people. Yes. So there's a big task for us to restructure the enterprise of modern science and technology, which celebrates exploitation, which celebrates extraction of knowledge, unfair and non-reciprocal expression of knowledge. And you have spent your lifetime in really looking at these processes from the scientific point of view. But our missions are not different. What we are trying to do in Honeybee Network is also to bring formal and informal science and technology together and to prove that both will gain from this marriage, this blending of shaking of hands. Both will become enriched.
Yeah.
There are so many examples that we have.
Absolutely.
The question that I wanted to ask both of you, from a point of view of the Western world, when we look at the challenges we have in climate change and you know, the innovations that are being brought forward but so slowly, is we are so much intelligent in developing ideas but very slow in taking action. And also when you look at society and civil initiatives, you know, the path to action and independent action is sometimes very slow. So this is at the heart of the grassroots innovations that you're talking about, of people really taking the initiative, nobody asking them, nobody paying them, but them taking the initiative to find a solution for something, and therefore also you know, spreading it. What is the learning that grassroots innovation can give the rest of the world, the Western world, in finding solutions that are sustainable?
The first lesson is decentralization. Second lesson is accept that we need distributed solutions, not one solution replicated everywhere. You know, that is contrary to the diversity principle of nature, which is that is necessary for resilience. If you go to a garden and there is only one kind of flower, you may not stay there for too long. You stay in a garden which has diverse flowers. So if that is the case, then decentralization, diversity, and possibility of different kinds of solutions through blending of formal and informal science. So I think the Western society must accept that everybody needs frugal solution, less material intensive, more knowledge intensive. Everybody needs solutions which are compatible with nature, but they need to be then diverse. You know, many times we make scale as enemy of sustainability. First question that an investor asks, what is the scalability of this solution? As if every solution must be scalable. If you make a solution scalable, you have green revolution model. Few varieties occupying the large area. That works well in the short run. In the long run, nature catches up and brings a new load of pest, new load of diseases and all other problems that happen. So we need to have diversity as a necessary condition, not sufficient, but necessary condition of sustainability and livelihood. Last point I would say is Western society should also recognize that creativity is not a preserve of a Stanford PhD or a Berkeley PhD. Creativity is something that a lot of people who are economically poor but are knowledge rich. These people are born with a desire to survive and therefore innovate. So creativity can be with a driver, with a lift person, with a parking lot manager, with a vendor on the street, with somebody who's keeping your accounts. Anybody has a creative solution and they must get a chance to express themselves. And when we talk of it, the status and the skill are not correlated. People who may have low status may have a lot of skills, a lot of knowledge, and we should respect that. So we are really asking for restructuring of our society. COVID-19 gives us an opportunity. In 2 months when there was lockdown, nature had regained itself.
Yes.
Pollution had gone down. You could hear the sound of the bird in the daytime. You could see in the night stars so clearly that many children had never seen in the cities sky so clear, right? We are going back into the same mode of destructive model of development. We have learned nothing from COVID-19. So my feeling is that we should now try to reflect, take a pause, step back and ask ourselves, is there anything we learned from COVID-19? And what we learned from COVID-19 is what grassroots innovation is telling you. That small, decentralized, large-scale solution is what will take our society forward and not just one or two quick fix solutions. I don't know what Fritjof says on that.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And I've actually written about this. I wrote an essay with a friend and colleague, Hazel Henderson, about lessons to be learned from COVID-19 and about a systemic analysis of the crisis. And this is, I posted this on my website, which is fritjofcapra.net. So it's a very thorough systemic analysis that shows exactly what you're saying, that even though the health consequences and the economic consequences have been very severe, the ecological consequences have been very positive. And they have been positive because of a radical reduction of human activities with the lockdown. But the same positive consequences can be achieved with a radical change rather than a radical reduction. So those are, and I see the coronavirus as Gaia's biological response to the emergency that humanity has brought upon itself. So I agree very much with you. But I also want to respond to Camila's question about sustainable solutions. And I want to emphasize that in the world today, there's no dearth of systemic solutions. We have hundreds of systemic solutions. And in fact, in my book, The Systems View of Life, Pierluigi Luisi and I examined and reviewed the existing systemic solutions, and we spent 60 pages in the book going through these systemic solutions. So, and we conclude that today we have the knowledge, we have the technologies, and we also have the financial means to move toward sustainability. What we don't have is the political will and the political leadership. But now there's another lesson that COVID-19 can teach us. When humanity realizes that life is at stake, we are capable of acting in a very coherent way and in a very decisive way. This worldwide lockdown has shown us that. And although in some countries it is not successful because of wrong policies, in other countries it has been extremely successful, beginning with China, New Zealand, Australia, and now many European countries. So the question is, can we apply these insights? Can we generate the political will and leadership to also deal with the climate emergency and other systemic problems that we have? But we have the solutions are there.
Yes, yes. We often talk about trying to change the level of consciousness, but I really appreciate, Anil, what you said, because the conditions that you expressed are pretty much contrary to what many countries' policies are today. We talk about decentralization, while startup programs are very much centralized, even though they pretend sometimes not to be. You talk about diversity, which is contrary to very often scaling up being implied copy-paste. And you talk about blending the formal and the informal in terms of research and innovation. So indeed, I think this period of COVID and the shock that the world is living is a way for people to also think otherwise and perhaps open up and change habits. To have a response differently to a problem than how the response has been so far.
Camila, I also want to add that today we have a very broad range of solutions known as eco-design, design modeled after nature. And eco-design solutions embody the basic principles of ecology. So typically, eco-design solutions are decentralized, they are diverse, they are free of toxics and pollution, they involve constant recycling of materials, and they are very labor intensive, which is good because they create jobs, and they are community oriented and community enhancing. So there's a whole eco-design revolution that goes exactly in the direction that we need.
Wonderful.
Indeed, indeed, indeed.
Anil, do you want to say something?
No, I just would say that I have read the book of Fritjof Capra, Our Physics, long time ago. Mm-hmm. And I'm so happy that today we spent some time together. He has been a guru to many people who at that time were looking for new ideas and new synthesis between East and the West, and he offered that very beautifully. I think the new direction in which grassroots innovation movement is taking the world is a reversal of globalization. I just wanted to say that toward the end. Small g to capital G, grassroots to global, rather than large corporations telling things to the small people, which they do all the time, all over. We should be able to create markets for the thing that small people produce, so that money from our pocket goes to their pocket. It is that reversal of income flows which will empower the creative communities, the compassionate communities, collaborative communities, and provide a new hope of tolerant and assimilative societies. So I'm very hopeful that this dialogue will trigger many more questions, and hopefully the viewers of our discussion today will have more questions to reflect on and contribute towards the new synthesis that we are looking forward.
Very good.
Wonderful.
I couldn't agree more.
Yes. And what are the key messages that you would like to convey to all the listeners?
I would say that for me, it was very impressive to see how the various concepts embodied in the systems view of life, which I have worked on very intensely for the last 30 years, how these basic concepts appear also in Anil's work with grassroots communities. And I think this is not a coincidence, because as I mentioned before, the systems view of life basically involves a change of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. And these networks are living networks that are active in communities, networks of communications, networks of creativity, networks of exchange of knowledge. And so I'm not surprised that the basic principles that I have identified in science, in this new systemic understanding of life, can also be observed in communities. So for me, this was a very beautiful match, that we observed, and the beautiful conversation. And I'm very happy to have met you, Anil, and I hope we will collaborate in some way in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anil. Thank you very much, Fritjof, for the conversation, for listening to each other, asking questions. The conversation is not only about sharing, it's about learning and observing. So thank you very much for this beautiful moment that you have shared with us today.
And Camila, thank you very much for being such a good chemist. You have brought a new chemistry in the place. So nice, so wonderful.
Yeah.